Week 17 is here. The Fantasy Championship weekend is upon us. Yet there are still some tricky injuries and other decisions to navigate, Ed. So we're going to get stuck straight in with our Week 17 starts. First up, if you've got a QB that you are looking to start, then I would be going for Dak Prescott. Still available in a handful of leagues. He's only about 82% rostered. So if you're struggling, maybe worth a look. He's got the Commanders this week. He's only had 1 week outside the top 12 since that Week 10 bye. And yes, he finished off watching the game against the Chargers on the sidelines after that blowout victory for the Chargers. But he should get it done for fantasy this week. So I would absolutely plug him in against Commanders defense. I think Dak is a handful of those players that has got QB1 overall potential this week when you look at the matchups. Michael Carter versus the Bengals. The Bengals give the most fantasy points for the game to running back over the season, 30.74. That has dropped to 26.78 over the last few weeks, as we've seen the Bengals defense wake up a little bit. We mentioned a few weeks ago when we were looking ahead to playoff schedules that we weren't quite sure which Cardinals running back would be the person to go for. Carter seems to be more of the work, so he's where I would lead. I think he's got solid flex value with a bit of RB2 upside this week. I don't think we're talking of the games of a few weeks ago where you're almost guaranteed an RB1 performance against the Bengals. Ramondre Stevenson, a player that we've not mentioned much this season, as Travion Henderson has taken over the role. At the time of recording, Travion Henderson is still in concussion protocol, so that is one to watch. But the Jets are going at the 5th most over the whole season fantasy points per game to running backs. Over the last 4 weeks, the 2nd most. You look at what Stevenson's done, he's producing kind of flex-worthy points, even with Henderson in. So I think he'll do that again this week, even if Henderson is back against a horrible Jets run defense. It likely won't be flashy, maybe 12 to 15 points. But if Henderson is out, Stevenson really could put up some big numbers this week. Now, the Vikings wide receivers. It's interesting with Minnesota because we've constantly said don't start wide receivers against Minnesota because how good their defense is doing. You've also not been able to start your Vikings wide receivers very often this season with any confidence. So the Vikings get the Lions this week, who are given the most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. So you obviously, Justin Jefferson, regardless of his struggles, is locked in. I think he's still about 92% started, regardless of how poorly he's done at this time this season. I don't think his fault. That is more of a Minnesota thing. So I'm going with Jordan Addison this week as being a start. He's only passed 15 points 3 times this season so far. I'd bet on him making that 4 this week because the Lions just have been fantasy gold against wide receivers. It's not one with, I think it's one of my less confident starts, but the data suggests it should work, Ed.
Yeah, Jordan Addison is someone who's disappointed me this season. I took a punt on him in quite a few leagues, hoping that he'd come back from his suspension and hit the ground running, but he just hasn't. And I think that's been down to the quarterback inconsistency, partly in Minnesota. Big season for him next season, Addison. You're quite right. He could well have a game this week. But yeah, just been disappointed me this year.
Next, we've got Jacoby Myers, who faces the Colts this week. The 3rd most fantasy points per game to wide receiver over the season, the 5th most over the last 4 weeks. He's been quieter over the last couple of weeks, but you look at the matchups, and that makes perfect sense. The Colts are nothing to be feared, though, against wide receivers. And I think with Trevor Lawrence's newfound swagger, he's looking like a proper quarterback at the minute, especially from a fantasy point of view. Myers is one of his preferred targets, and I think he will benefit this week and should be in for a strong outing. And then finally, Zay Flowers, Pro Bowler Zay Flowers. Even as a Ravens fan, I'm not sure I completely agree with that. More fumbles than touchdowns has got to raise a question mark. But Zay has been quietly getting it done over the last few weeks, despite the Ravens' struggles. He's been wide receiver 8, 10, and 9 over the last 3 weeks, averaging 12 yards per target, which is solid numbers as well. Lamar's not guaranteed to be back at the time of recording. So I think it should be in consideration for you wide receiver 2. Zay Flowers should be locked in at flex, though, given that the Packers are quite a leaky defense to wide receiver over the last few weeks. Zay is a player that we said at the start of the season we were expecting him to be a low-end wide receiver 2. He's kind of delivered that confidence. And it's the inconsistency you expect for any player at that position. Would you be plugging him in confidence? Is he one of the only semi-reliable options on this Ravens offense at the minute?
Yeah, you can't rely on the tight ends, can you? He's the only, outside of Derrick Henry, maybe. He's the only reliable option, really. And I think it's interesting you mentioned consistency, because that surprised me, actually, that he's been a top 10 receiver over the last 3 weeks. That is the consistency you crave from him. Another player that's it's a big season for next season. Would you start him even if Huntley's under center, or would you avoid him then?
He was solid with Huntley towards the end of the game this week, and Huntley does a decent job when it comes to kind of fancy output for your receivers. So I think, are you going to get, regardless of who plays, are you going to get at least flex value from Zay Flowers? I think so. Are there many players you start in your flex spot you think could have the ceiling of putting up top 12 numbers? Is in a small group of players there. So I think I would be starting him, not with confidence for top scores, but with confidence for at least a floor, I would think. Should we talk about some sits though, Ed? And I was trying to avoid having too much focused on just a couple of teams, but it felt impossible this week because we've got players who likely have got you to your championship game either over the season or last week, that you're not starting with any confidence at all this week. So I completely appreciate that saying we sit Justin Herbert, we sit your Chargers wide receivers, we sit Jared Goff and Jameson Williams sounds counterintuitive, especially based on what we said recently.
Matchup for the Lions.
It really is.
Horrible matchup, and you must be, if you've got a load of Lions in your lineup, you must be absolutely nervous as hell.
So I'm going to do it up front, so I'm going to clump them all together. So Herbert and his wide receivers have been far from consistent this season. We said this with Justin Herbert last week. The data suggested he was going to have a big game. He did, but that stands out against his previous production over the last few weeks. The Texans are averaging 12.01 fantasy points per game to QBs and 24.93 to wide receivers. That is all wide receivers within that wide receiver room. So obviously that's going to be split between every wide receiver that's eligible. The Vikings have kept some big players quiet too. So averaging 12.22 fantasy points to quarterbacks, 24 wide receiver groups. I'd be starting St. Brown anyway this week. We said this with JSN a few weeks ago, didn't we? That we'd want to sit him, but you're not going to. You start your studs. I think we're doing that of St. Brown, but he comes with risk this week, 100%. That's why Williams is far from consistent anyway, so I'm definitely benching him. Goff's been solid since the week 10 bye, but he still had 3 games outside the top 12 since then. You may have no choice but to start Goff, but I'd at least be looking to waves and looking to my bench to see if I had a better option. So I appreciate all of those options. You may not have anyone to start. And if you disagree, I should have led with the start of the show. If you disagree with us, especially if you're going for the championship game, go with your gut. There is nothing worse. And if you make a decision based on something someone else said, and then you thought you knew what the right thing to do was, this is just how we're looking at it. You go with your gut if you're in the championship game. You'd rather lose it because of your own decision than listening to us. I can guarantee you that. Breece Hall, though, I don't think I need to sell this one too much. So, yes, Henry tore holes in the Patriots defense last week and inexplicably was sat for the last part of the game. But the Patriots have been solid against running backs so far this season. Breece Hall has not been solid this season. Breece Hall is also not Derrick Henry caliber. It's been so up and down. I'd be confident that it's a down week this week, so I would be sitting Breece Hall. And then, Ed, the Chiefs running backs, they've got the Broncos this week, who are giving up the fewest fantasy points per game to running backs overall. Can I ask, why is Pacheco started in 14% of leagues? If he benefited from his RB21 finish last week, that's more luck than judgment. And then how is the confidence for Kareem Hunt to be being started in 27% of leagues when he hasn't broken 10 points since week 12 and scored a combined points of 3.2 over the last couple of weeks? That feels like that's just laziness in hoping that the Chiefs will do something. I think especially with Mahomes out, there is zero confidence in either, and they should be on the bench in every single league this week.
I just think from a fancy perspective, looking at for our prop later, the Chiefs are involved in that, and I wouldn't touch any of their players from a fancy perspective. I mean, even with Mahomes this season, you look at their roster and you think, who's got them to wins and got them fancy points? Mahomes had a great season up until his injury, but no one else has at all. It's been a bit of a nightmare if you've drafted Chiefs players.
So looking at the Broncos defense, though, so I said last week to ETN because he was facing that tough run defense. He was still inefficient last week. There's been a couple of games where ETN's put up the numbers, but you look at his stat line, it takes a while to work out where the points have come from. He had an RB18 finish, but that was more to do with lots of dump off passes from T-Law. So he got it done from a PPR point of view. A very short touchdown pass as well. So that didn't pad his stats. He still had to do the work to get them, but not enough for me to worry this week about thinking about starting a Chiefs running back. I think it's back to business for Denver against running backs this week. And I reckon Hunt and Pacheco combined for a maximum of around 10 points. So, yeah, I wouldn't be starting. If you are in your championship game with either of those, then they're on your bench anyway. You've not started any of them in recent weeks, have you? Before we move on, then, please do take a moment to subscribe, to like, and to give us a share. We've got loads of stuff planned for throughout the off-season and through the playoffs as well, especially looking at some DFS. Ed, before you go on to your starts and sits at your plug-and-play quarterback option this week, we'll be feeling that maybe this isn't of any relevance if you're in the championship game, but time of recording, Lamar may be out, although you've done very well to get to your championship game. We're playing Lamar this week. JJ McCarthy is out, and he'd had that friendly run that had perhaps got a couple of people into their semi-final. Jordan Love is out with concussion. So, especially with McCarthy and Love, you may have had them plugged in if you'd had Daniel Jones or Mahomes. Mariota's out as well. So there is a chance you'd muddled your way through to that important game, having to pivot around at quarterback. So a couple of these options may well be in consideration for people to try to get a win this week.
Definitely. And as we've just mentioned, I'd be very, very dubious starting Jared Goff this weekend as well. So a couple of these might be relevant to you, especially two of them. First up, Tyler Shook. He has the Titans this weekend, and he's 22% rostered, so likely to be available. He's had quite a solid run of fantasy form over the last 4 games. He's been QB 12, 6, 16, and 16. And he's completed 24 or more passes in 3 of those 4 games. Plus, he's got that rushing upside. He had a couple of rushing touchdowns against Tampa Bay in week 14. He has the Titans this week, who have struggled against quarterbacks recently, conceding the second most fantasy points per game over the last 4 games, at a touch under 22 points per game. I mean, he's someone we've spoken about this season, Shook. Maybe he isn't someone who we thought would get a number of games this season, but he has, and he looks kind of locked in as the Saints quarterback, unless they go somewhere in the draft. Is Shook someone you might plug in this weekend if you had an option?
He makes me a lot more confident about my Chris Olave starts. I must say, it turns out that Tyler Shook is the quarterback we need for Olave. I can't remember where it was sourced, so I can't kind of give credit, but someone X had said that the Saints have kind of finally replaced Derek Carr with Derek Carr when it comes to a fantasy point of view. That it looks like he's going to be destined, if he carries on the way he is, to constantly be around QB 12 to 14 on the season, but very much being a situational start. And I think you're right. Looking at this game, there is a path you could start him. Would Goff or Shook, if you were in the fantasy championship game, who are you going for?
I just think the Vikings have been so relentlessly good against receivers and quarterbacks. I think it's nailed on that that Goff gets fewer than 10 points almost. So I think I'd go Shook.
It's a sort of thing. The logic makes perfect sense, but if we put that out on X now, there'll be so much negativity for how stupid we were and how you're going to bench Goff. But yeah, I think I would be inclined to go the same. Kirk Cousins is back in the conversation as well, though. Ed. That's not what I was expecting end of this season.
No, indeed, he is. Yeah, and he's starting his 6th consecutive games against the Rams in Monday Night Football. I mean, he's warming to the role. He's been better for fantasy managers last couple of weeks, QB3 and QB12, with a total of 51 completions, 6 total touchdowns, and just 1 interception. A bit like the Titans, the Rams have struggled against quarterbacks. They've conceded the 3rd most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks over the last 4 games. So, again, Kirk Cousins is someone with his experience and with the weapons that he has. He's someone that I'd probably be looking to slot in if I was struggling at quarterback. Someone I wouldn't be looking to slot in, but I'm mentioning him nonetheless. Josh Johnson, if you are absolutely desperate. We always look who has the Cowboys. And this week it's the Commanders. But the issue is Jaden Daniels is done for the season. Marcus Mariota does look doubtful for week 17. So next up for the Commanders is 39-year-old Josh Johnson. Now, it's of course very unlikely that he will have any fantasy relevance. So it seems almost a bit frivolous to recommend him. But he does have the Cowboys. They have consistently been a shocking defense and always seem to give up big points to a variety of positions, including quarterbacks. And of course, they are the worst fantasy defense against quarterbacks, conceding close to 25 points per game across the season. So you never know. Would I start him over, let's use that analogy again. Would I start him over Jared Goff? Probably not. But who knows? Who knows against that Cowboys defense?
I have picked up Johnson on waivers this morning. So we're recording on Wednesday morning because in a Superflex Dynasty League, I've been plugging just anyone into my second QB slot due to injuries over the course of the year. So, yeah, Josh Johnson's going to be starting there to hopefully make me avoid losing the whole thing and being the toilet bowl champion. So, in Josh Johnson, I'm hoping I can trust
good
to
luck.
avoid that embarrassment. We shall see. Let's move on to some streaming tight ends then. And it's a cast of regular names, Ed. I'm going to start off with Darren Waller, who we mention every week due to his schedule. Last week wasn't what we hoped for. He was involved, though, and the Bengals defense are on the way up. That's the one thing we kind of said before, didn't we, is maybe to temper expectations a little bit, whereas the Tampa defense just seemed to be on their way down, especially towards tight ends. So Darren Waller available in just over half your leagues. If you're needing to make a pivot this week due to matchups, then maybe consider picking Waller up. Colby Parkinson didn't have the week everybody thought he was going to have. It was a hot waiver wire pickup. It just didn't get it done in the way we thought it would. It was Terrence Ferguson that did all right instead. But I'm roll this out again because the narrative last week still stands. Devontae Adams still unlikely to play. Colby Parkinson has still been more involved over the course of the last few weeks. The Falcons haven't been bad to tight ends, and that's who he's facing this week. But I just think that when you're so unsure with your tight ends, Parkinson's usage and what we've seen recently just makes me a little bit more confident in him than some other options. So I don't see a repeat of Ferguson's big points. I do think we'll be back to Parkinson being the main fantasy producer this week. Just a week later than we all thought. But it does come with that thing. Obviously, we didn't get it quite last week. If I am looking, though, to try to grab a tight end off the waiver wire this week, it's going to be Brenton Strange, who's still available in just under half of all of our leagues in redraft. 7 targets and a touchdown last week, followed up by the Colts defense with the 3rd worst of fantasy tight ends over the course of the season. We've mentioned him a few times. He is up and down, but this week feels like a safe tight end 6 to 10 sort of window. And I do wonder as well, look ahead to next season, how much more is he going to be targeted in drafts, later in drafts as your tech and tight end option potentially than he was this year? We had him as a a very deeply kind of stash last year. I think he's probably just stepped above that threshold and is going to be in the, if you draft 2 tight ends, or one of your consideration picks, maybe.
Well, yeah, he's going to be a Super Bowl champion, so I imagine he'll be quite high up.
If you are making it into that treasure game, you need to consider every single aspect of your team, though. That includes your streaming defenses, and I'm very, very glad to see one of those on there have leapt up in rostership over recent weeks as well.
Yeah, we'll talk about those momentarily. First of all, though, the Patriots, who have gone up in rostership this week and over the last few weeks, they're up to 62% rostered. The reason I recommend them, and so you can see they're available in a third of leagues, so they might be available, is they have the Jets. Now, the Patriots are defense 10. They got minus points for the first time this season in weeks 15 against the Bills in that really offense-heavy game. They were much better against the Ravens last week. I just fancy them to match up really well against that Jets offense, who are just going through a horrible time at the moment, just waiting for the season to finish. And the Jets offense gave up 20 fantasy points to that Saints defense last week. And the Saints were somebody who we recommended as being great for your kind of fancy playoffs run. So if you've locked them in, well done. You got 20 points last week, which will have made a huge difference. Their rostership has increased, but they're still available in nearly half of leagues. Cam Ward and the Titans, they've been better of late. And an example of this is that he's only thrown 1 interception in these last 7 games, having averaged close to 1 a game before that. I still think the Saints defense will make life very difficult for him, be full of confidence, and I expect them to get double figures again. If you're looking for an outside bet, the Giants might be somebody to look at. They're 5% rostered. They've got the Raiders, and they're widely available. Over the season, they are defense 29, below the Bengals, but they have put up decent points the last couple of weeks. 9 points against the Commanders in week 15 and 16 points last time out against the Vikings. This week, they face another struggling offense in the Raiders. Geno Smith has had more downs than ups this season. So I just fancy the Giants to continue their good run of form. And I could see them getting a sneaky double-figure score against that Raiders offense this week.
So if you're streaming your defenses, some options for you there. And if you did pick up the Saints on our recommendation a few weeks ago, congratulations. Sometimes we get things bang on. Let's have a look at our final feature, though, Ed, and we're going to get competitive for the final time this season.
Fantasy Fox, Hester versus Ed.
It is 8-7. If you get a win this week, we are going to need to rely on our tiebreaker, which we've not looked at, but we're feeling fairly confident I may clinch. So, maybe still rudimental anyway. We shall see. It went 8-7 because I managed to get a win last week after successive losses. We were doing our top 5 fantasy players. Would they be scoring above or below their baseline average? The standouts there is I felt fairly confident that Josh Allen, despite the tough matchup, would beat his average of 24.3.
Horrible.
He was significantly lower, so I should have stuck with what we'd felt we'd known from the data before. See, we vary from the data. I go on vibes and it all goes wrong. Jahmyr Gibbs, though, I said higher against the Steelers. I thought he'd get significantly higher. By 0.1 was the margin there. That ended up being the difference maker as I got 3-2 and took it to 8-7 overall. This week, though, Ed, we are looking at a festive offering for our fantasy prop. In fact, I'm going to jazzy the screen up even a little more. Look, there we go. Even more festive for us. We're looking at our Christmas list draft. So we have 3 games taking place on Christmas Day. Cowboys, Commanders, Lions, Vikings, Broncos, Chiefs. The Christmas Day special in Netflix. I know it's on Netflix in the UK. I'm assuming that is the same in the US as well. But from those 3 games, we drafted a quarterback, a running back, wide receiver, tight end, and then we had a free flex spot choice as well. My team's on the left, yours on the right. You had first pick, Ed, and you went for the obvious first pick.
Yeah, I mean, it's great. It's a great prop, this was, because I think they're interesting matchups from a fantasy perspective. So I just looked for the only difference maker I could see. I knew that if I went Gibbs, you would go with who you went. But I just thought Gibbs, is probably the only matchup proof difference maker in those 3 games, potentially. I went for Gibbs.
And I went the exact same logic. There's only one quarterback I was really happy with in this, and I'd recommend him to start. So I had to go for Dak. And then I wasn't sure which of the 2 options you'd go for here.
Yeah, again, I think there were the limited options at tight end, so I was very tempted by Jake Ferguson. But I was happy with my tight end in the end. So I just thought against the Commanders, CD Lamb, and I was kind of hoping you'd go with Ferguson, because then I could cover all bases with my next pick.
And that's exactly how it went. I very nearly went for George Pickens, but I once again went for the one player, despite him having a down few weeks, the one player I was happy with at tight end, and it gave me my Dak Ferguson stack. I was really hoping you go elsewhere, but the reason I was going to go for George Pickens is he was the obvious next choice, and that's where you went.
Yeah, put George Pickens into my flex spot, because I knew that I had free choice at tight end and quarterback pretty much. So I knew I had to take Pickens there.
So that then gave me free run of wide receivers and running backs, because you had your quarterback and tight end left to go. So that gave me, in no particular order at this point, Terry McLaurin in Josh Johnson. I trust St. Brown. We've said about that tough matchup, but it's Amon-Ra St. Brown. Regardless of the matchup, he has it in him to have a monstrous game. And then I'm not really happy with running back, if I'm honest. So I went for Chris Rodriguez, because he was the next best option for me. You ended up going for Broncos to finish off your roster.
Yeah, I just think the Chiefs managed to make the Titans look pretty good on offense last week, and they do look like they've checked out for the season, don't they, without Mahomes and out of the playoff hunt. So I fancy the Broncos to have a good game against them. So I think Knicks will have a solid game, and they also struggle against tight ends. I think they're certainly in the bottom 10 in terms of fantasy points per game. So Ingram, as unreliable as he is, was probably my next best option at tight end.
And I must say, I am completely confident this week that you're going to get the win. Looking at those teams, I'm far happier with yours than mine.
My team does look better on paper, but who knows? It would make it exciting, at least. I'm happy to be in with the shout, Mark, because I was so far behind at one stage. I'm just happy to be here.
That is us then finished for our Week 17 preview. We've kind of cobbled together a few features from our shows there, just so we don't have to record over Christmas Day, because we're going to be eating, drinking, and indeed being merry. Anything else you want to say about Week 17 before we depart, Ed?
No, just wish all our viewers a Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and we will see you on the other side.
Yeah, have a great break. Whatever you're doing, if you're celebrating, please enjoy. If not, just enjoy spending time with family. We may be back on Saturday for a DFS show. We're just going to see how full of turkey and pork we are by that point, and whether we can be bothered, if we're completely honest. But we will see you for a review of Week 17 and some exciting bits reviewing the fantasy season before we look ahead to the off-season. It's almost done already, Ed. We are here at Championship Weekend already for fantasy.
I know.
So for the final time for the regular fantasy season, it's bada bing, bada bye, and Malcolm, take us home.
You have been listening to the team from TH Fantasy Football. For more content, follow TH_fantasy_NFL on Twitter and Instagram.